All right, here we go. So tonight we're going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of various types of Martin housing. And when I say Martin housing, I mean both houses and gourds, not just houses, just for clarification there. So this presentation is brought to you by two groups. There's a little bit of overlap in both. So I'm the current president of the North Carolina Purple Martin Society. You can find us online at ncpurplemartin.org. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account. And also the Purple Martin Fanatics is a great Facebook group to join if you're not already familiar with them. And they also have a great YouTube channel you can check out for more information. So the format of the presentation tonight, I'm just going to show you what we're kind of going to go over there. So first we're going to go over the survey results from a few weeks ago. And then we're going to get right into the presentation of the various types of Martin housing and the brands. Then we're going to go over a summary of all that information and some parting thoughts to just kind of think about. And then we'll do the discussion time at the end. So if you have a question or a comment while we're going along, just kind of jot it down on a piece of paper if you could and save it till the end, and then we'll get to you at the end. So for the survey, we sought to discover what is the most frequently erected brand of house or gourd. And we took that information and used it for this presentation to make sure that we're covering relevant information for the majority of the landlords who might be viewing this presentation tonight. So we advertised it in 3 places online, and we had a great response rate. We had 104 people that responded, and we thank you so much for taking the time to respond to the survey. So what were those survey results? You might be curious about that. So as far as houses go, most respondents did not have a Martin house at all. Some did have a mix of house brands, and the brands are in order of most to least own in frequency. Number 1 is the S&K Martin house. The second was Troyer T14. Then we have the Trio Martin houses. And if you're not familiar with any of these brands as I'm going along, don't worry, I'll show you what they look like, just so we're all on the same level playing field. Fourth type is a Homemade house. Then Lone Star Housing, the Heath House, the Sunset Inn, the Trendsetter, Coates, and then other unidentified housing. So how about gourds? You might be curious what most people own. So the number 1 brand of gourd that was owned from the respondents was the Troyer gourds. That's either the horizontal or the vertical gourd. And again, if you don't know what those are, I'll show you in a few minutes. The second one is an S&K gourd. Then we've got super gourds, excluder gourds, natural gourds, heath gourds, and then other gourds that were not identified. Out of all those respondents, remember there were 101, 11 of them did not own any gourds at all and just a Martin house. So what are S&K houses? What are S&K gourds? What do they look like? They're also called royal wing houses. So these are very commonly found in feed stores and Tractor Supply. Sometimes they're Lowe's or Home Depot or other big box store will carry these. They're also available online. It's a very common plastic house. It's often a starter house that people will use to get into Martins. So sometimes people say, well, I have a Martin house. It's kind of red. It looks kind of like a barn. I don't really know what it is. So this is the red barn model here. And then some of the other models are shown here. You can see their dimensions and their approximate weights here, and we'll come back as to why that's important later on. So a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of those S&K and royal wing houses. So first we're going to talk about the advantages. So the number 1 advantage to them is they are inexpensive. And for a Martin house, this is very inexpensive, about 74 bucks. That's just for one of the basic older models. And that does help get a lot of people involved in the Martin hobby. They are widely available. As I mentioned earlier, you can find them just about anywhere, online and in your local stores. They are pretty easy to assemble. The directions are pretty simple. They just snap together. It's fairly easy to enlarge the compartments on the inside. You can use a simple cutting implement of your choice to cut the inside walls out and enlarge the compartments, which definitely is recommended. Now, what about the disadvantages to these houses? And if you own one of these and have not been into Martineering very long, you do want to pay attention to this section. It's just something to be aware of. So a lot of the S&K or Royal Wing houses have UV resistance issues. Some of them, particularly the older models, were not manufactured with a UV resistant plastic. So over time, what you will see with these type of houses is that the plastic will fade or become brittle and may start to break over time. The parts may break easily because of that UV resistance issue, and there have been various landlords that have reported that these houses have blown over in storms and have broken. The house compartments are often undersized. What does undersized mean? So for Martin houses, the recommended size for compartments is either 6 by 12 or 7 by 12. And that's important if you think of the fact that a Martin is about 7.5 inches. So these little 6 by 6 compartments are definitely too small for our purple Martin, and we need to keep that in mind when we have housing up for them. The plastic is often translucent on these houses. So translucent plastic can produce a greenhouse effect in these houses, and they can overheat, and they can hurt the eggs or nestlings inside. A lot of these Martin houses made by S&K have attic compartments that are inaccessible. There's no way to open them or get in there without a pair of long-handled needle nose pliers or something similar. And what we often recommend is for people to just shut off those compartments completely or screen them over so they could be used for ventilation, but not necessarily for the martins to nest in them. They are very hot. It's hard to get in there, and the eggs and nestlings have a hard time being healthy in those compartments. So moving on to S&K and Royal Wing gourds, they make these various bow gourds. There's all types of bow gourds they've come out with over the years, and you may recognize some of these from the little original bow gourd here to the big bow gourd over here on the left, and then they had, I think, the new version of the big bow here. I don't remember what all those were called. And then another common one that we're seeing is the bow 9 or bow 11. These are often sold in stores like this with no porch, no tunnel. And then they've come out with these newer types here. I believe they're calling them bow axis gourds. And they may look a little familiar to you, especially this one on the left. It seems to look a whole lot like a Troyer horizontal. Some people have noticed that. And these bow axis gourds are apparently convertible. You can have them in a vertical style or horizontal style here. And they start out at about 20 ounces of weight, but they can go up in weight when you're adding a tunnel, you're adding a porch, you're adding a cooling cap, etc. So some advantages or disadvantages to these gourds are as follows. Some of the models are inexpensive, $12 plus just for a one gourd each. They are widely available, about the same place you could buy the houses, you can find those gourds also. There's various styles and sizes available for various budgets. Wing entrapment is built into some of these models, and that's important when we're trying to keep our martins healthy. Oftentimes, if you don't know what wing entrapment is, let me back up a little bit. Wing entrapment is often found at the beginning of the season when martins are fighting over cavities, either in houses or in gourds. And one martin will be fighting another martin, and one martin will try to back out and get out of the gourd, and it may not be able to head out straight on, and it can become stuck in an entrance. So wing entrapment guards help prevent that from happening, and S&K has tried to build these into some of their models. Some of the gourds are double walled. The Bow 11 Plus is one of those. And those with cooling caps may have better ventilation than some of their base models, so that's something to consider. Now, some of the disadvantages of these gourds are as follows. As we mentioned earlier with UV resistance with the houses, this can also be an issue with the gourds. The plastic is not UV resistant on many of the models. It can particularly be an issue for caps and for porches. Some of the models, when you buy them from the store, they don't include the porches, the tunnels, and the cooling caps. All those things are extra. and oftentimes they're not in a local store. You have to buy them online, and then the cost kind of racks up when you consider all of those extra accessories. Many of them are shallow. So what do I mean by shallow? What I mean by shallow is either they aren't very deep horizontally or vertically, and this can become an issue when you have a lot of young that are crowding around a porch to be fed. It becomes easier for one of the nestlings to fall out or to be pushed out. Some of them, like the Bow 9 and the Bow 11, have plastic snap-on caps with the base model, and those can be difficult to handle. There have been landlords that have reported having trouble getting these caps to snap on or to stay on when they're snapped. There have been reports of people finding the caps blown off in a storm because they weren't snapped on all the way. So if you have these snap-on caps, make sure that they're on securely. S&K does sell an adapter kit now to replace these caps with a screw-on cap, but again, that is extra. You have to pay for it if you want that change on those older models. And some of the models are quite small. A gourd should be at least 9 inches in diameter to safely house a marten family. And some of them are less than that size. So that's definitely something to consider if you have any Royal Wing or S&K gourds. Another thing that's been noted is these double wall gourds like the Bow 11 have been prone to mite issues. There have been many landlords that have complained that their nests have become overrun with mites with these double walled gourds, and there was just no way to get in there and get the mites out in between those walls. So that's definitely something to look out for. So moving on to the next thing, now we're going to talk about Troyer T14. So T14 can be wood or polywood most times, and they are a pretty big, heavy house. As you can see at the bottom, 85 plus pounds, depending on the building material and depending on if it has nest trays or not, etc. So advantages to T14s, they have large compartments. They are nice past the minimum size requirement, so that is nice and healthy for the martens. They are sturdily built and insulated, which is helpful for weather extremes. There are plans available from Troyer or PMCA if you don't want to buy it already made, or you can buy it if you're not handy, and you can buy it made from wood or polywood. There's SREH, which is starling resistant entrance holes available for these houses, which helps if you're if you're having issues with starlings like most landlords do. And they are made already for a winch and cable system for easy management. They're also trap ready. Now, some disadvantages to T14s to consider. They are expensive. No doubt about it, they're expensive. If you think about the cheapest house we just talked about all the way up to this one, there's a big price difference there. One door on the T14 opens all the compartments at once unless it's modified. This can be an issue if you are looking at multiple nests on one side and you've got some young that are close to jumping age or fledging age, and you're still trying to monitor other nests on that side that are younger. So you have to be careful doing nest checks when you've got one door that opens all the compartments at once. So they are pretty heavy. Remember the weight I mentioned earlier, 85 plus pounds. So it requires a large pole. So you've got a heavy duty pole, you've got a lot of concrete thinking about here to set up this big heavy house. The only SREH option is a Conley 2, unless you modify it or build it and with your own plates. If you just buy it straight from Troyer, it's a Conley 2 is the only option there as far as SREHs go. The nest trays are not included with this house. So if you want the nest trays, that's an extra expense either to build or buy those. And with a lot of houses, they're subject to porch domination too. What porch domination is, for those who may not know, is when a male marten takes over an entire side of a house or an entire ledge, depending on how the house is situated. And that can reduce the number of nesting pairs you have in that house. Also, some landlords have reported that these Troyer T14s are attractive to starlings because it's a big, deep cavity and it's dark, and that can be very attractive to them. So moving on to Troyer gourds. So here we've got the Troyer horizontal on the left and the Troyer vertical on the right. Now on the bottom here is an older version of a Troyer horizontal. You may still have some of these if you've had Troyer gourds for a while. I have a couple of these at a public site. So weight varies here, 18 to 24 ounces for each one of those. So about Troyer gourds. Advantages. So these gourds are overall made very well. The plastic is opaque as opposed to translucent. We mentioned that term earlier, opaque. They're UV resistant and the plastic lasts for a nice long time. They're nice and large too, 9+ inches in diameter. Remember we mentioned earlier that that's the minimum size requirement for a gourd for a martin, is you want something that's at least 9 inches in diameter. So they are definitely that. They're horizontally deep, and this can be useful against starlings trying to reach in and pull out nesting material. How many of you here, and I know there's so many of us here, have got SREHs on our racks at home, and you see a starling sitting on the porch and he can't get in, but he's still being a pest. He takes his long needle beak and he just tries to reach in and grab nesting material and just pull it out. And it's so aggravating to watch that. Well, when you've got a gourd with a long tunnel like that, that can help cut down on that kind of behavior. So the current versions of the Troyer gourds that are sold now, they come with a tunnel, a porch, and an SREH, which is nice. And the SREH that's offered is a Conley 2 entrance. And if you're one of these landlords who's always used round holes and you want to make the move to SREH, which is very wise, the Conley 2 entrance is generally speaking very easy for martins to learn. So that is a plus. And it is trap compatible. The access caps are large and durable. They're easy to get on and off, and they are UV resistant. They also have suggested ventilation drill guides in the back of the gourd. You can put elbows there, you can drill the holes, or you can add a ventilated cap also. So some disadvantages to these, they are moderately expensive, so $29 each, and that can add up if you're buying 8, 10, 12, or more of these gourds at one time. It can be a bit of an investment. The other thing about these gourds that we've noticed over time is they tend to seep rainwater around their push pins. The push pins are this area on the top of the tunnel here, tunnel attachments on the bottom, and sometimes in the hanging holes in the top. The horizontal gourd tends to build up condensation on the inside. So it's very important when you've got these horizontal gourds to try to ventilate them properly to help avoid wet nests. Now, I will say this, all gourds tend to have wet nests if the water is going up from the underside of the drainage holes in the gourds. And that's a whole nother separate topic that we did talk about last year on how to help waterproof gourds. And you can go back and look at some of our previous videos on that subject if you're interested. So at Troyer gourds, they only have one type of SREH offered at this point, and that's the Conley 2. In the past, they did sell excluder 2 plates, which I loved, and I used to buy those because here in the Southeast, we have starlings galore. And many people in the Southeast, like myself here in North Carolina, have encountered starlings that have been able to breach the Conley 2. And it was really nice to just cut that out and throw an excluder 2 plate over that and problem solved. So there are ways around that now. They have starling stoppers that they offer now that you can buy. Of course, it's an extra expense. Or you can put your own type of WEP or wing entrapment plate over the entrance to help prevent starlings from getting inside. They have a shallow vertical depth. They're deep horizontally, which is good for starlings, like I mentioned earlier, but they have a shallow vertical depth. And what some landlords have noticed about these is that this can increase the likelihood that the nestlings will crowd into the tunnel and end up on the porch or crawl out and fall out on the ground. Like all gourds, they need ventilation added to them. Ventilation elbows or vented caps added, as I mentioned earlier. Now, moving on to Trio. You may have seen these houses out in fields, and these houses have been around for a really long time, and they're a nice old traditional Martin house. Most people won't, how do I say this? So when I ask somebody, do you have a metal Martin house? And they say yes or no, they may not know who it's made by, and some people call them different names. And a lot of times on Martin forums, you'll see these referred to as Trio houses, not Nature House or Erva Martin houses. Trio is pretty much the common name there. And there's different styles of these Trio houses that you will see. And they're not very heavy, weight about 11+ pounds. It depends on which model it is too. Okay, so some advantages to these Trio houses. As I mentioned earlier, they are popular, and this brand has been around for a long time. Many people get their start in Martin's using these houses. They are durable. I've heard reports of these houses lasting 40, 50 years with just some hardware being replaced on them. They're easily modified. If you have the old style that has the 6x6 rooms, it's easy to knock out a wall and make them 6x12. They're fairly affordable for a Martin house, about $200 each. Some of the models are made for a rope and pulley or winch and cable system, and this is important for management and cleaning out and nest checks. The subfloors are included in this house, which is a huge plus to help prevent wet nests. The traps are made to fit. Many of us love sparrow door traps, and they are very handy for trapping house sparrows. And they are now in stock again, I hear. If you had heard last year or previous years that they were gone, I hear they are back in stock again. And it's easy to do nest checks with the Trio. Every single compartment door opens separately, so you can get in there and do your nest checks. The SREH doors are available for these houses too. And they have ventilation and drainage features built into them, which is handy. Now, there are a few disadvantages to this house to keep in mind if you have one of these. One of the main things is that the attic is uninsulated in many of the models, especially if you have one of the older ones. And they can get pretty darn hot on the underside of these houses. And if Martin nestlings overheat, they can jump. Sometimes they can even cook if it's really hot outside. So this can be an off-season project if you have one of these houses to either add insulation to it or come up with some shade panels to use for next season if you're in the area where things get really hot in the summer, and many of us are. Sometimes these houses are more attractive to house sparrows for whatever reason. The hardware can corrode in these houses, the old aluminum hardware. Some parts can rust, some can corrode, and the replacement parts can be kind of pricey if you go to the Irva's website. The base models tend to be 6x6 compartment sizes, and we do recommend that you go ahead and enlarge those to a nice, healthy 6x12. Some of the models have lanyard locks, and they can be problematic. I've heard more than 1, 2, or 3 complaints about people who have used these houses and the lanyard locks have gotten jammed or just broken completely, and people get frustrated and just end up taking them off. The house can spin on a round pole, so that's something to consider too. And if it spins, the rope can get twisted inside the house. I have helped a few elderly landlords that have had these old houses, and they've left them up for a long time, and the house is spun in the wind and the rope's twisted, and it gets so bad that you just have to take the whole thing down, take it apart to untangle the mess. So definitely don't want it to get to that point. So moving along to Lone Star. Lone Star is another brand of house. And you've got the Lone Star Goliath here on the left and the Lone Star Alamo here on the right. A lot of people think the Lone Star Alamo looks a lot like a T14. So we're getting a little bit heavier here with weight about 37 pounds on these. So a little bit about the Lone Star houses. They are well built. They last a long time. The compartment sizes are nice and big, 6x12. Easy to do nest checks with the doors that open very easily. They don't tend to get stuck, and the hinges work well on them. The attic is insulated as compared to the Trio house. You may have remember how I mentioned that earlier. That's an important thing to help keep the Martins comfortable. And they have ventilation features in each compartment. They're made for winch and cable system, which is nice for easy management. And they're part of the buy one, get one free PMCA grant program. If it's important to you to support the PMCA, you can look into that grant program. And they are trap ready. Now, some disadvantages to these houses. They are pricey. Again, remember our first base model, $70 some for an S&K. $770 for one of these brand new is expensive. One door opens more than one compartment. So in the case of the Goliath that's pictured here, you've got your door opener right here on the end. You pull that pin out to swing that door open, and then you've opened 2 compartments here. So that can be an issue there, again, if you've got older nestlings mixed in one compartment next to younger nestlings. It does not come with nest trays or perch rods. Those are sold separately and add to the cost of the house. The other thing about this house is it needs a small cable size due to the tight spacing on the glide model between the walls of the house and the pole that comes with it. You can't just stick any old cable in there. It takes a really small cable. And when you've got a small cable, that limits the amount of weight you can put on the pole. And they're also only made for 2-inch square poles. Sometimes it's difficult to tell if the door is latched properly. I found with these that you've got to watch the push pin on these, and once you put it in the hole, you got to give it just a gentle tug just to make sure it's actually lined up in the hole, because if it's not, it could blow open pretty easily. Some people have reported wing entrapment with this house. The metal doors are thin, and that can be a risk when you've got housing with thin entrances. Now, moving on to heath houses and gourds. So here's an example of the different types of housing that Heath makes. I've seen a lot of these wooden houses float along as Christmas presents. People end up getting these and they don't know what to do with it. I've seen this plastic house in some people's yards, and then they make an aluminum house over here, and then they've got various gourds. And you can see the sizes of some of these gourds. And this one's pretty light, this gourd over here. So some advantages to some of these, they're generally widely available and easily found just about any place, either in person or online, that sells Martin House equipment. They're relatively inexpensive. The houses starts at $129, the gourds $27 plus a piece. There's various styles available. And the newer version of the Heath gourd is improved some, but it's not widely available. I just did a quick search online and it was hard to find it for sale anywhere other than the Heath's website. Now, some disadvantages to these houses and gourds. Many of them are inaccessible for nest checks, or they have round holes. Can't protect your martins from snarlings if you've got round holes. So that's a definite disadvantage to this type of housing. Inaccessible for nest checks since they don't have ports or any way to get into the gourds. That's definitely a downside. Many of the compartments in the plastic houses or the wooden houses are too small. Same thing with the gourds. I was once given one of these Heath wooden houses to mess with, and I did it as a project just for fun, and you would not believe how small the compartments were. I believe the inner compartments were 5 by 5, and it was just way small and with a round hole. So it needed a lot of work just to make it Martin friendly. The gourds may be translucent. Again, that's an overheating issue. It's unhealthy for martins to nest in a translucent gourd. And they need ventilation, just as with all other gourds. The houses are not made for rope and pulley or winch and cable. And when they're like this, it doesn't encourage management. And when you've got a situation where a house is on a pole and you can't get up to it, it makes it much harder to get the motivation to get up there and do what needs to be done if you have a problem, not to mention the fact that it's unsafe to get up on a ladder up high and mess with a house that you can't get down. So moving on to super gourds. So you can see these are a little heavier, 32 ounces for super gourds. Advantages of super gourds. They are a large, deep gourd. So we're getting a little bigger here, 10 inches in diameter. It's a deep gourd from the porch to the bottom of the gourd, and it's a nice big diameter. So they are opaque and UV resistant, and they last for many, many years. I've got some gourds at some of my public sites that are 12, 13, 14 years old and still look brand new. The newer versions, and this is nice, come with porches, an inner and an outer porch. Some of the older ones that I had did not come with porches, so I was left to find porches or buy porches or build porches. So it's nice that they have porches now. They are trap ready. And some disadvantages to these gourds. They are expensive, so $33 a piece. Again, that number adds up when you have to buy a whole lot of these to fill up your rack. The disadvantage of these is the inner porch. If you need to put a trap in there, it has to be removed when using the associated super gourd trap. Otherwise, it gets in the way. There's only one SREH option for these, and that's the crescent. And like all other gourds, it needs ventilation elbows and or vented caps added to it. Now moving along to the excluder gourd. 32 ounces, so you see it's about the same weight as the previous gourd. Now you'll notice a visual difference between the excluder gourd and the super gourd here. The excluder gourd was modeled after a natural gourd, and if you're not sure what you're looking at, you can kind of see how it has these vertical marks on it going up and down the side. That's one way you can tell if you're looking at an excluder gourd. Just a little tip. So some advantages of excluder gourds. A percentage of the sales benefits a PMCA mission. So if that's important to you to support the PMCA, every time you buy an excluder gourd, they get a little bit of that money. They are large, vertically deep gourds. Again, nice big gourd, 10.5 inches in diameter. This helps prevent nestlings from getting out, wandering out on the porch, or being pushed out or jumping out. They are opaque, UV resistant, and they last for years, which is nice. They come with an inner and an outer porch, which is a big plus, not having to buy a separate porch. And they have a wide variety of SRH options, SRH options. So you're not just stuck with a crescent. You can get the excluder 1, excluder 2, the WDC. All of those are options with the excluder gourd. And they are trap ready. Now, some disadvantages to these gourds to keep in mind. They are expensive, $33 each. Again, that number adds up if you have to buy several of these. Some of these have slightly undersized SREH. So what that means is they came out of the factory a little too small. So if you have some of these gourds, had not heard about this issue already, we've been talking about this a lot on the forums, a lot about it on the groups of these gourds being undersized in some cases. If you have some of these gourds and the martins aren't nesting in them, you need to go check them. Make sure that they're not too small. They should be 1 3/16 inches across the top middle of the SREH. If you don't have any way to measure it, if you have an old film canister, you can stick that in the middle of the hole and see if it'll go through. If not, it's probably undersized. You can check it with calipers or you can check it with a film canister. Check it twice if you can. So on some of these older models, the caps may not be UV protected or be opaque. I have a few older excluder gourds. I noticed this problem with some of mine. The caps were starting to crack over time and they needed a liner added to them to make them opaque. I hear with the newer ones, this is not a problem anymore, but it's definitely an issue for the older ones. So you definitely want to check that in the off season if you have excluder gourds and check on the condition of your caps. They need ventilation elbows and vented caps added, as with all gourds. They can't get hot in there. Another thing that I've noticed about the excluder gourd is a porch assembly can be super awkward. Even as a woman with relatively small hands, it can be really hard to get in there, get in that entrance with a screwdriver in my hand and hold it in her porch and hold a screw in there and hold a screwdriver in there and try to get it all together without dropping the screw or the nut or whatever on the inside or the outside of the gourd and not muttering a few colorful words in the process. It can be a really frustrating thing. So it can be awkward. You got to have some patience for that. Now, moving on to natural gourds. I like this picture here. These are some nice large natural gourds that I had gotten, and you can see in this case, they were the same size as this excluder gourd in the middle. So pretty big natural gourds. So some advantages to natural gourds. They are lighter than most plastic gourds. Of course, the weight varies depending on, since they're a living product, depending on how big they are and how thick the walls are. They are inexpensive, or you can grow them yourself. Of course, the price varies depending on what supplier you get as to how much they're going to cost you. So I can't really give you a price there per se. They're easily replaced since they're a renewable product. They're nice and dark on the inside and they're opaque. And because they are dark on the inside, this can often be attractive to martins at new sites if you're trying to attract them to a new colony site. Because it's a natural surface on the inside, the nest bowl interior is non-slip. That can help prevent splay leg from happening to the nestlings. And they can be cut to your creative specifications. If you're a creative person and want to take that gourd and turn it into either a horizontal gourd or a vertical gourd, you can do that. Now, so disadvantages of natural gourds to keep in mind. They can be high maintenance. So you may end up having to repaint these things every year. If you don't mind doing that, then that's fine. Lots of prep work involved. If you have a natural gourd, you've just grown it, there's a lot that has to be done before it can be ready for martins. You've got to cure it properly, then you've got to sand it and clean it out, and then do all the things to it that make it martin ready, have the correct entrance, have a clean out port, et cetera, et cetera. So it could be a lot of prep work going into one of these. They are easily broken if they're dropped. Ask me how I know this, unfortunately. Or if they fall off your rack, heaven forbid, they can break. They are susceptible to chewing and pecking damage from other animals. Even if you store them in your barn or you store them on the floor and a mouse or a rat or something else gets in there and starts chewing on them, they can be chewed up. And they may be tricky to grow depending on your local conditions. They take a lot of space, they take a lot of fertilizer, they take a lot of sun, and not all of us have those conditions. My husband will never ever let me try to grow these again because he was not happy how they ate the lawn. They took over my garden, they took over the vegetable garden, and they decided to take over the world and went down the lawn. He said, never again. So I don't do that anymore. Okay, so with these gourds, they can be difficult to trap non-natives unless you're using a Troyer tunnel to put on the gourd. Now, moving along to Sunset Inn. So this house doesn't weigh very much, about 8 pounds, one of these things. Advantages to Sunset Inn. So they come with Crescent SRH option. So that's kind of nice. The Crescent SRH is one of the most common SRHs. So most Martins have either seen it or they learn it fairly quickly. The fairly large compartment size on these, 11 by almost 6, which isn't by 5, which isn't too bad. There's offset entrances on these to help discourage porch domination. I talked a little earlier about what that means. The roof is insulated, which helps cut down on temperature issues. They're moderately priced, $270. They have either a telescoping pole option or a rope and pulley or winch and cable option, and that depends on if it's purchased as a system or where you get it from. A lot of these come with a metal telescoping pole, which I have messed with a few times and found them very difficult to deal with a telescoping pole. I would, generally speaking, not recommend telescoping poles to anybody because they can get stuck, they can pinch, they can fall down, and they can injure you. So if you can get these as a system with a rope and pulley or winch and cable system, that's definitely better. And these can use the Trendsetter insert trap. Now, some disadvantages to these, they may be prone to wing entrapment. Again, you got that thin metal surface there on the inside. And the subfloors are unfortunately sold separately. If you use these houses or any other houses without a subfloor or nest tray, it may cause wet nests. And what could happen is if rain blows into the entrance, it just pulls up right there on the metal floor and it could get soaked up into the nest. That's definitely not a healthy situation for our martins. And the compartment doors can be tricky to close if nesting material gets into the door hardware. So you've got to make sure that it's clear, doesn't have any pine straw or needles or whatever they're using in the hardware before you get the door shut to make sure it's shut all the way. So moving on to the Trendsetter. So got about 25-pound house there. That's the base model, goes up from there, the bigger the house gets. So some advantages to the Trendsetter. It is a quality house and it's built to last for many years and it has nice, large, healthy compartments. It's made for a winch and cable system, which is easy management and safe management. It has nice deep porches and that helps protect from driving rain, which is kind of nice. The roof is insulated. That helps with wide variances in temperature. And it has these handy little ventilation ports in it that can be closed early in the season when it's cool, and they can be opened later on when it's hot. The base model comes with wire subfloors, and they can be upgraded to nest trays. So at least it comes with something that's kind of nice. The SRH that it comes with is a Crescent. Their entrances are staggered, and there are porch dividers on the house. It is also easy to clean. Now, some disadvantages to this house, the nest trays are not included. As I said earlier, it generally comes with wire subfloors. You can upgrade it to the nest trays, but the nest trays are not necessarily included. Some of the older models have reported wing entrapment issues with this house, so that's definitely something to keep an eye on if you have a Trendsetter. They are very pricey, $916 plus just from one of these houses. Some landlords have reported the side access doors getting stuck when you're trying to open and close them, so that's something to keep an eye on. Other landlords have reported owl issues with this house. These large porches on this house may encourage the nestlings to wander outside as they get older, and this nice wide area provides a grab area for owls, so something else to think about too. So the smaller version of this house that is the houses with only 8 to 16 compartments, only come with a 2-inch square pole. If you're in a nice, big, open, wide area where there's a lot of wind, you may need a larger pole. In that case, you may need the different size house. And there's only one SREH option with these, and that's the crescent. Now moving along to the Coates or Water's Edge house, about 17-pound house here. The advantages to these, they are widely available. You can often find them in places like Wild Birds Unlimited or other birding type stores, as well as online, and the PMCA also has them. They're one of the more affordable aluminum houses, about $280. It's easy to double the compartment size in the older models. A lot of the older ones have the 6x6. It's easy to enlarge the compartment size if you want to do that. They have the Crescent SREH, and they have some ventilation features in them. Now, some disadvantages to these houses. Telescoping pole. So these houses, as far as I know, none of them are made for winch and cable or open pulley. We mentioned earlier some of the disadvantages to dealing with telescoping pole systems. And they can have heat and wet nest issues too. If you want a subfloor, they're available separately in the older models. The older ones didn't come with a subfloor. So there have been several landlords that have complained about wet nests with these Coates houses. There's also been several landlords that have complained that for some reason, they are super attractive to house sparrows. I could not find any information on these houses if they had a trap made for them or not. So if you know if they have a trap, let us know during the Q&A. Okay, moving on to the chirpy nest. So a chirpy nest is neither a house nor a gourd. It's kind of an interesting thing here. So here's what chirpy nest looks like when it's hung on a rack of gourds. Here's when it's just a whole bunch of chirpy nests. And then here's one face on, and here's one from the side. Little heavier here, 39 ounces. Compare that to the weight of a super gourd or excluder gourd. So some advantages to a chirpy nest. They have a pretty large nesting cavity, and they hang on a gourd rack. Good ventilation and drainage features. They have drainage and ventilation in the back here. There's ventilation in the front, and it supposedly cross threads right across the front there. They have several different SREH options. It's not just a crescent. They have what I hear now, the newer ones, while you could still get them, had WDC or modified excluder options there too, which is kind of nice. They have a wood nest tray, which is included. You don't have to order it separately, so that's definitely a plus. These things were made for people who deal with blowflies. So if you have blowflies in your area of the country, these are a good option for you. And the reason that they help with blowfly is the nest tray has a mesh in the bottom, and it's made so that when the fly lays the eggs and the blowflies, after they have a meal, go down into the bottom, they just end up falling out of the nest tray and rolling out the bottom, and they can't stay in the housing. So some disadvantages of chirpy nest is they are expensive, $45 each. So think of trying to fill up a rack full of these. They are expensive, and they are currently back ordered until at least this fall, if not further until then. They are shipped assembled. So you cannot buy them unassembled and put them together yourself. They are shipped assembled. And as I mentioned earlier, they have that mesh nest tray. That makes application of 5% carbaryl powder difficult to control mites because it could just go right out the bottom. So that's a drawback if you're in an area of the country where you deal with mites. And some people find their unusual or non-traditional appearance to be a drawback as well. They don't look like Martin housing to some people. So you may draw more questions from your friends or neighbors, etc., and they may wonder what that is. It's just something to think about. And as far as I could tell with the research, they do not have a trap that goes with these. So if you have a house sparrow problem and they end up in a chirpy nest, not sure what you're going to do. If you've heard differently than that, please let me know and we'll talk about it in the Q&A. So let's kind of round all this out. We're getting towards the end of the presentation here. So how much does it weigh? Let's talk about how much these things weigh. House and gourd weights from lightest to heaviest. So the lightest houses are basically the plastic houses. So you've got your S&K and your Heath plastic houses, and then it goes up there to aluminum housing, Heath aluminum housing, the Sunset Inn, and the Trio. And then as you go up to wood houses, things get heavier. Interestingly enough, the Trendsetter, which is aluminum, is also pretty heavy. The Lone Star aluminum house is also pretty heavy, and then the T14 is the heaviest of them all. Now, how about gourds? Now, surprisingly, the Heath gourd is the lightest, about, I think I said about 9 ounces and up for those. But if you consider that they are light, thin, translucent plastic, it kind of makes sense as to why they would be so light. Then the S&K gourds, another sometimes translucent gourd here. Then we got the Troyer gourds, and then the excluder gourds and super gourds, and then the chirpy nest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the super gourds and excluder gourds are about the same weight, and the chirpy nest here isn't technically a gourd, but I've got it under here because it can hang on a gourd rack. These things are the heaviest. So how much does it cost for the base model? Money. So houses. Here's your prices. It's a very interesting range of pricing for these houses. The S&K is definitely the cheapest, and then all the way up to the Trendsetter, which is about $916. So it can really vary how much money you spend on housing, but generally you get what you pay for. We'll talk about that in a minute. How about gourds? Now you get this $10 each price when you buy Heath gourds in bulk. If you buy them singly, they are a lot more expensive, which is kind of interesting. But I noticed that on the Lowe's or Home Depot website, it was offering this bulk pricing there. S&K starts at $12 a piece, and they go up from there depending on which gourd you get. Natural gourds, again, varies in price depending on where you buy them. The PMCA is selling them for $20 a piece, and that's just a plain gourd that's not been painted, that's just been cleaned out. And then Troyer, $29 a piece. And the super gourds and excluder gourds, $33 a piece. And then you've got the chirpy nest at $45 each. So a few parting thoughts as we consider all of these things we've just gone over. I know I've kind of gone fast and thrown a lot of information at you, but this is just something to consider here. So price should definitely not be the only consideration when you're erecting Martin housing. Why is that? You have to think about if you're willing to modify or improve the housing. If you are getting a less expensive house or less expensive gourds, are you willing to do what it takes to make that house better or to make those gourds better, to make them healthier and safer for Martins? And also, if you get a less expensive gourd or house, are you willing to replace it in a few years if it breaks? Or are you one of these people who just wants to buy it once and expect it to last for a nice long time? Another thing you need to think about is who's going to manage the housing. Is it going to be you? Is it going to be your spouse? Is it going to be your family? Do you expect to be able to do it by yourself? What if you become disabled or if you become elderly and your movement becomes limited? Who's going to manage that housing? You might find it much easier to deal with it by yourself or with limited motion if it's on a winch and cable or rope and pulley system. It is safer and easier. And also, you probably won't need help to do that unless something gets stuck. But something to think about. Another thing to think about is, what do the Martins around you like to use? If the Martins within a 10-mile radius of you have all been fledged in Troyer gourds, then the sub-adults that are coming back that next year may be looking for Troyer gourds to start the new colony site. So if you're trying to start a new colony site, sometimes you may find it helpful to put up similar housing to what your neighbors are using or the closest Martin colony to you is using, even if you don't intend to use that housing long term. If all the Martins, for example, around you have been raised in trio housing, you may consider putting up a used trio for a year or two, and then once you've gotten a pair established at your site, if you want to take out that trio and put up a gourd rack or put up some other housing, then you could gradually do that in time and take the trio down after you've got several pairs. One thing to keep in mind here, no Martin housing is perfect. So the goal of this presentation was to help you be aware of possible issues with your model, whatever it is, to help you attract Martins and to keep them healthy and safe. Keep them healthy and safe. That is our priority here. So now we're going to move into Q&A and discussion time. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself.
Courtney, it's Frank.
Yes.
You may remember meeting my wife and I over at the Beaufort Farmers Market a few months back.